Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's session for the Society of Evidence-Based Policing here in the UK, but also abroad in the States. Thanks very much for tuning in. Really appreciate it. My name is Alex Murray. I'm a commander in the Met and lead for violence. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce Renee, who's live from the States. Firstly, thanks for joining. This is the 7th in the series of 10 things that will change policing from an evidence-based policing perspective. Next week, we've got Simon Harding talking about urban violence. So please tune in. For those people who are not members of SEBP, you can join in 10 seconds just by going to sepp.police.uk. That's here in the UK. Or if you're in the States, you can go onto the website there and join there. So welcome. Right. This is going to be a really good presentation. Renee and I have gone back quite a long period of time. Renee was 22 years in the Sacramento Police Department. She served as a patrol officer. She served as a detective in recruitment. She served in the regional transit system. She's a Fulbright Research Fellow studying gang violence with the Met here where I serve. And she's the co-founder of the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. Today, she's going to talk about 10 mental models that will change the way you police. In September, her book, which is 21 mental models that will change policing, is out. I thoroughly recommend it. I've read it. It's really good. And in fact, it takes someone like Renee to read it. She's a bit of a renegade. Look her up on TED Talks. She's slightly crazy, but with that perspective, she puts a whole new light on how we think in policing and has the incredible insight of having been a very experienced practitioner, but also an exceptional researcher. She's got a PhD from Cambridge University. Renee, I know you live in a forest 10 minutes away from the new Apple Academy. So, and I also know it's very early in the morning. It's a real pleasure to have you come and deliver this seminar. I've been really excited about it. We had Thomas Apt a few weeks ago, also from the States, and that was brilliant. And you're really welcome. For folks tuning in, please have a listen to what Renee's got to say. If you've got a question, just put the question in the chat bar, start it with a Q, and then at the end, I'll field those questions and ask them to Renee. Great. Okay, Renee, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. I threw up, since I had to wake up so early in the morning, I thought I should start off everybody's day with a nice little pre-test. So there's just 2 questions up here if you want to take a screenshot so you can maybe take a look at it. Because what we're going to go over a bit about the 10 mental models is a lot of data. So when we're talking about like the top 10 ways to challenge how the police should think, what we're going to go over is really like how to think about data, how to display data, and the issues that we have with data in policing. So if you want to take a screenshot of that, it's just a quick, looking at how we display data in CompStat, looking at this month versus last month data, and then probabilities. So even though it's about mammograms, you could see it walks you through like a probability question of how many women would have breast cancer. So not hard math, but if you could, I'd like you to test yourself so you could see like what you instinctually think the answer to the problem is versus like how you would work out this problem. And then why that is important to us in policing, we'll go through that too. So hopefully you got a screenshot of that because I'm going to stop sharing, but we're going to walk through that later. So I'm going to stop sharing that and I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint. And we're going to go through here. So my other thing besides, giving you a pre-test this morning, I also stayed up late doing this PowerPoint and this presentation. So I thought I'd kick it off with a nice rhyme that, data are dumb. Our brains are too. I love evidence-based policing. Why don't you? So starting off with the data are dumb. So when you think about our data, and why I say data are dumb is because our data really has no meaning, right? We have to imbue data with meaning. It just is, they're numbers essentially. So unless we contextualize them and understand them, we don't really know what they mean, correct? So when we look at something like this, and this is from Matt Ashby's blog, I'll probably mention quite a few books and blogs and people throughout my talks. If you want a list of those books, I always share my reading list with people because this is where I get my information. I will tell you right now that I base all my work on other people's work. I am not that smart. So if you look at, this comparison, 114 homicides to 86 homicides, it looks like you have this really nice crime drop, right? So you're thinking, and this is Atlanta data, that they, are doing impressive work. What's happening in Atlanta? Are they doing something to improve their outcomes when it comes to homicide? But you're only looking at like two comparison data sets, right? You're looking at 1 year to the next year, 2016 to 2017. But when you look at it within context of 2010 from 2018, you could see that now that, the 114 homicides dropping down to 86 homicides, it's actually like a blip within the data set, right? So now it has new meaning because you're contextualizing it. So when you think about data, like one of the first things we need to do is that data can't live in a void. Data really has to have human meaning. It doesn't show causality. It doesn't show why things are happening. All data does is give you an idea that something is occurring. So a lot of times when I think about evidence-based policing and using research, using data to drive decision-making, you have to remember that there's a human element to it too, right? It's not just like we're looking at data and we're making decisions. You have to go deeper into the data and understand what that data means, right? And the other important thing, as you could see from those two slides, right? So if you look at the way the data is displayed there and then the way data is displayed here, how we display data, how we compare data, and how we analyze data impacts people's perception and understanding of data. And that's a really important point. And I know I talk about these 10 things, but really these mental models about our understanding of data and the way we conceptualize things is really important, because I would say probably within the last 3 to 4 decades, we've come to understand our brains a whole lot more than we used to. And we realize that being numerate is not something that human beings are really good at. So it's important for police, both for the public, but also for our command staff, for our officers, to show data in a way that is meaningful and actionable for everybody, not just internally. So when I say binary percent changes are meaningless, what I'm talking about is a little bit of what you just saw. When you look at like binary comparisons, right? When you look at this week to this week or this date to this date, essentially you have to think about like, what are you trying to understand and what are you trying to know? So if you look at this is actual data from a police agency in the US, looking at their last 8 weeks to the prior 8 weeks, looking at their violent offenses, property offenses, and Part 1 offenses. So if you look at like the prior 8 weeks to the last 8 weeks, you get this really nice, percent change, that you get a nice 24% drop in violent offenses, a 6.9% drop in property offenses, an 8.8% drop in Part 1 offenses, right? So you think, okay, well, whoever is the commander of this area of the West Precinct is really doing a great job. But you have to think about, like, contextually, like what I said, and then you have to think about the arbitrariness of data also. So when you take those last 8 weeks to the prior 8 weeks, and then you start looking at, okay, why do I care about the last 8 weeks to the prior 8 weeks? What if I look at something different? So now if we take a look instead at just like the violent offenses, and we look at their same data sets, and we look at the last week, the last 8 weeks, the prior 8 weeks, that's what we were looking at in the previous slide. And then now we compare that to the last week to the prior week, you get a better improvement, you get a 30% drop. But when you look at the last 4 weeks, the prior 4 weeks, now you get a 33.3% increase. You still have that nice 24.6% drop when you compare 8 weeks to the prior 8 weeks. The current, year to date to the prior year to date is a 20.2% increase. And then the last year to the prior year is a negative 8.9% drop. So the question becomes like, which binary percent change are you going to use to drive your decision making? So that's why I was saying that to some extent, like binary percent changes are meaningless, right? Because you could choose any data set between any 2 points in time and find some difference between the two. And the difference between those two, depending on which direction you're going, will be different for the same numbers. And what I mean by that is here. So when you have a percent decrease compared to a percent increase, you have a similar, here's one that's pretty close, 22% to 24%, but your raw numbers are very different, right? So although you have a similar percent decrease to a similar percent increase, your raw numbers are very different. And the reason is because the way we do percent change, right? So here's the formula for percent change. So if you have 10 crimes in 2013 and it increases 20 crimes, the way you do the math, you're going to get 100% increase. But then when you do the 20 crimes going to 10 crimes from 2014 to 2015, you get a 50% decrease. When your denominator is lower, essentially, is when you're going to, so when your denominator is lower and when the percent change is moving from lower to higher, your percent increase will always be greater than the percent decrease. So if you think about this, and this is why, I say it's deceiving and unethical reporting, and then I have my asterisk there that says, in my opinion, is because when you look at, and I don't mean this, that it's unethical for policing, you see this in reporting. And in my normal slides, I have this nice picture of the Sacramento Police Department where they were reporting on, Sacramento violent crime jumps by 37%. Well, whenever you're increasing, like it shows here, it's always going to be higher than if you had that same percent decrease. So your percent changes is influenced by your denominator, and percent increases or decreases are something that our brains really just don't understand. The other piece that's really important when it comes to our data and thinking about our data is that our data really is dirty and it contains a lot of noise. So when you think about data, data has a lot of variance in it. So there's two things when data first comes in is if any of you have ever tried to understand your data, and to give you a good example, I would say like mental health calls is one of those calls where that data is extremely dirty, right? If you think about, if you just took on the face of calls for service, try to take a data set that was all your mental health calls. The way those are coded and the way those are cleared, depending what systems you use, how well your officers are trained, if you've even gotten to this issue within your police department, all your calls for service might not be coded as mental health calls at the back end. Because we know in policing, a mental health call could come out as somebody trespassing, as somebody creating a disturbance, as a welfare check. They could come out a lot of ways when somebody calls into a police department. And it isn't until an officer arrives on scene that they determine, oh, this is a mental health call. And then the call may or may not get changed in the system, depending on the system's capability. And this is the part that a lot of people in the media, a lot of people in the public actually don't understand, is our systems that we have aren't perfect, and our computer-aided dispatch systems aren't made to collect really good data, right? Our CAD systems are meant to dispatch officers out into the field and get them there quickly and to take in information so that the way the officers know what they're going to, right? It's not a good data collection system. So some of our process, when we're trying to understand what is happening out in the field, we already have limitations when it comes to understanding something as simple as how many mental health calls do we have coming in. And then we also have issues, as we all know, that some crimes aren't reported, or some crimes are reported and it actually ends up being another crime. So when I say our data is dirty in policing, that is what I mean, is that there's parts of our data that when it comes out of a system that we have to go in and clean. And then it also contains noise. And this is the issue with thinking about like a binary comparison or binary percent changes. There's noise within data, and what that means is that there's random fluctuation in all data. This is true for like physics, anything in the natural sciences, and even the hard sciences. They talk about it within labs. So within labs, when you're setting up a test and a scientist runs an experiment, there's still variation when they run those experiments because they're a human being running an experiment. And they make decisions about what to do with that noise. You'll hear about people when they do their studies, they get rid of outliers. In policing, like our noise tends to come from these fluctuations in crime data. And when you do binary percent comparisons, like a week to week or month to month, what you're doing is you're not accounting for that random fluctuation. So where you see a peak and a drop, and you react to that, what you may be reacting to is a natural fluctuation in your crime data versus something actually happening. So that is why I was saying that an important part of policing for both us internally, but also to our external stakeholders, is we want to display and talk about and convey data and information in a way that people can understand it. So one of the things that have been used, not a lot, is a statistical process control chart. It is something used by Simon Guilfoyle. They're over in the UK. He's got a book. Oh, now I'm going to blank on the name. I'll have to look it up, but his book is wonderful. And then also here in the US, Nick Pettititi up in Rochester, New York, follows his work also and uses what's a statistical process control chart. And this is something that's been pulled from the business world. And the idea in the business world was that it's based on a little bit of the Pareto principle, right? That things concentrate. So rather than reacting to all these small fluctuations in the business process and in the process of like making your widget, what Walter Sherwitt, I'm sure I'm butchering his last name, what he developed was this statistical process control chart to look at the process of building the widget over time and deciding that, okay, where in this process do these random fluctuations go above a statistical deviation, and then signal, because it's a signal within the noise, to us that we should be paying attention to this. So this is a very simple statistical process control chart. So if you look at this, and Nick made this for me, you have this data fluctuation that's just going up and down randomly, right? But if you took like all of the data over the course of 3 to 5 years and you tried to find like the upper control limit and the lower control limit, so if you see the dashed lines there, that's the upper and the lower control limit. Nick and Simon, I think, both suggest like 2 standard deviations, which is a typical, looking at a bell chart, what you see at the ends of the bell chart, what you see for looking at things that are abnormal, right? Like if they get beyond 2 standard deviations, then you're viewing data that is outside of like your normal range. In policing, like in the mental models book, I actually suggest more like maybe 1 standard deviation, because in policing, if we're going outside of like that really 70% average, that's where I think you should start paying attention. And this is the biggest thing with data, right? I think a lot of times when we see these fluctuations, these spikes that go up and these spikes that go down, what we've been trained to do because of the CompStat process is to have some type of reaction, right? But not all fluctuations require a reaction. What they may require is investigation into causation, right? Or correlation, because you can't really have causality unless you have a comparison group, and that's a whole different talk. But what you want to start examining your data for is looking at really your averages and your fluctuations within your data to determine, like, is it really going somewhere that I need to pay attention to it and understand it more deeply? I think sometimes in policing, where we make the mistake is reacting to our data and thinking we need to do something. And I think where that plays in a lot of places, when we talk about, over policing an area or biased policing, I think a lot of times we could maybe do a better job of stemming that over policing if we're less reactive. If we look at something like a statistical process control chart and we look at our averages and we have a better understanding of our historical data. And I know COVID, and also like here in America, we're getting these spikes in homicide, and everybody's wondering, like, is that going to reset, or is that going to set like a higher average? So for Nick in Rochester, like, he's watching it because he's not sure if that's going to reset like his averages that he's normally used to. The next point, and the reason why this is so important, is because humans are not innately numerate. So I know that we probably think we are, right? Like, we know math, that we were taught math in school. But when I talk about like innately numerate, I really mean like statistical numeracy. And it's because when we think about like risk, when we think about how to judge probability, we do not do it well. And they've shown, so Kahneman and Tversky, Kahneman wrote a great book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He talks about this in there, that how even with statisticians, like when we think about probabilities, like they don't even do it well. Doctors are the same way, they don't do it well. And the thing about policing is we're not even trained to do it, right? There's nowhere in our careers that we are trained to understand and process data. But yet within since CompStat started, so the last couple of decades, the expectation is for command staff to use data to drive, data-driven decision-making, to be numerate. But yet nowhere are we taught how to be numerate. So when I'm talking about being numerate, I'm not talking about that you can't do basic math. I'm talking about like understanding statistical probabilities and risk, right? So when you think about miscommunication and understanding, there are really three major forms of risk communication three major forms of risk communication that invite miscommunication. So the use of single event probabilities, which we'll get into bias in a bit, or biases and heuristics in a bit, but it goes along with the fallacy of law of small numbers. When things happen in very small numbers, they don't automatically translate into like these things are going to happen all the time. That's why, like in the media, when the media talk about like a terrorist attack or these things happening, people will worry about a terrorist event over like getting in a traffic accident. And then relative risk and conditional probabilities. Those are really the things that our brains have a hard time wrapping around. But natural frequencies help us to understand data better. So here's where, if you took the pretest, if you tried to do the math, which I hope some of you did to test yourself, and because I truly believe, like, I'm one of those people where I like being wrong because I think it's interesting when I find the way my brain works. So walking through this problem, it's about women getting mammograms, right? So age 40 to 50 in a region. And the question is, the probability that a woman has breast cancer is 0.8%, right? And if a woman has breast cancer, the probability is 90% that she will have a positive mammogram. If she does not have breast cancer, the probability is 7% that she will still have a positive mammogram. So imagine a woman has a positive mammogram. What is the probability that she actually has breast cancer? So if you think about, like, how do I do the math when I'm thinking about one of these women has breast cancer, like there's 8%, right? And then the probability is 90% of that 8% that she'll have a positive mammogram. But then if a woman does not have breast cancer, there's probability 7% that she won't have a mammogram. Like, how do you do the math to figure that out, right? That's that's a brain squeeze, right? But if you put that into natural frequencies, so that's the same information in natural frequencies. Instead of looking at it percent, if you look at it at 8 out of 1,000 women have breast cancer. And of those 8 women, 7 of them, which is the 90%, will have a positive mammogram. And then of the remaining, there's 992 women who don't have breast cancer. Some 70, that's the 7%, will still have a positive mammogram. Now, how many women have a mammogram? And I'm going to skip this next slide because I misplaced it. So if you look at this, there's 1,000 women, 8 with cancer, 992 with no cancer, 70 are positive, 992 are negative, 1's negative that has cancer, and 7 are positive. So that's our 9%, right? 0.9%. Of the 77 women who have had a positive mammogram, when we look, because now we have, right, we have the 7 that are positive that have cancer. We have 70 that are not positive with no cancer. So your answer is 7, right? So when you think about that, when you go back to that percent, and I don't know what you guys were getting, but when you talk about like women that they have a 90% chance, right? So that she has a positive mammogram and that there's a probability of 0.8% that they have cancer. That's where this gets really confusing. And people often think, oh my gosh, like there's 80% chance. And this actually, when they started talking about percents and that 1 in 10 women, would have cancer over the course of their lifetime, it drove women to have more mammograms. And the medical field started talking about the risk because young women really have a low chance of actually having breast cancer. But they were finding that the mammograms were coming back with like showing tissue density. So women were going in for procedures. But when you actually look at the relative risk over the course of a lifetime, you're talking about, and they showed that it's 1 in 10 women, was that 99 women would develop cancer over the course of 85 years. Well, yes, most women, when they start getting older in age, eventually could develop cancer. But when you're talking about younger women, it's really a rare event. And that's what they're talking about, like the public understanding, like what you're talking about when it comes to relative risk versus absolute risk. And they're 2 different things. And that's the slide that I skipped over because we just had a recent in the US, and I'm sure it went over to the UK too, but it was a publication of the National Academy of Science study that talks about that young men at the hands of police violence, that it's a public health crisis, right? That they're saying that they did this study that they're saying over the course of a lifetime that young men aged 25 to 29, it is the second leading factor of death, right, over the course of a lifetime as police violence. And it's the same thing when you think about relative risk versus absolute risk. If you go read the paper, when you go actually look at the number that they're talking about like 1 male in 100,000 over the course of 85 years. So when they talk about those relative risks, they're putting that into the context of how long a human being lives. So the same way that they created relative risk with women with breast cancer, and they create like this fear because it seems like, oh my gosh, 1 in 10 women are going to die of breast cancer, and we better go do some preventative education, preventative maintenance. When you look at like the absolute risk of that, it's 1 in 100,000 or for the women, it was 1 in 1,000. But when you look at the age breakdown, it's a lot different. So when you look at the National Academy of Science, and when they're talking about like this is a crisis, a public health crisis, because the second most, the highest risk factor for young men is to be killed by police. You're talking about young men from the ages of 25 to 29. Is when you're looking at health issues, what kills people from the ages of 25 to 29? Not many things. People from the age of 25 to 29 are relatively healthy. So they're not going to be killed by heart disease. They're not going to be killed by cancers. They're not going to be killed by many things over the course of a lifetime. They're going to be killed by accidents and things like police violence. So that's where, but talking about it in this, it's a public health crisis, and they're talking about relative risk over the course of a lifetime. It doesn't contextualize what is actually happening in the world. It creates a statement. And then if you look at all of the articles that are written about it, there's so many people saying, oh my gosh, we need to, have a study of this. We need to do something. But just like with the mammogram, when you don't place data contextually in a way that the public and stakeholders can understand it, it will lead potentially to negative outcomes. For women, the way mammograms and the publicity was used for mammograms led to women having procedures that they most likely didn't need. And they were drastic procedures. They were full mastectomies. There was a doctor that used a lot of this information to say that women should have full mastectomies at 20-something years old and have breast implants instead. Now we know that that's not true, because we should have been looking at it with the natural frequencies versus relative risk. And this is something also that when you're looking at drugs and medication. So it's something that when somebody's trying to sell their medication or their drugs, it's the same thing. They've shown that if you have people that are involved in a clinical trial for drugs, that maybe you get one study they showed where you get an improvement of 41 people that took the drug had these effects, but 32 had better effects, right? So your absolute difference between the two is 9 people. So out of 1,000, 9 people got better, right? But if you look at that relative risk, like the relative, the way they got, or I'm sorry, their relative improvement, it's the percent, right? So what it turns out to be, it looks like a 22% improvement, because you're putting the denominator of that 41 in there. So instead of saying like, out of 1,000 people taking this drug, 9 people showed an improvement over, compared to the 901 other people, they say it had a 22% improvement by taking this drug. So that's what people see, right? They see the 22% improvement rather than the 9 people. So that's why, like, number 6 is to communicate data accurately in a way that is understandable and actionable. That is something I think on policing that is imperative for us, that we have got to start looking at the way that we put data out into the field, the way we display it, the way we understand it. So that way, when the media puts it out and they change how it looks, that we actually can be articulate about how we have these discussions, and we can have these discussions in a reasonable way and not make policy changes based on inaccurate, and I shouldn't say inaccurate data, but data that's miscommunicated and not well understood. The next one is to challenge your thinking and peer review your perspectives. So when I talk about like challenging your thinking, a lot of times when we think about like what we know, a lot of what we've taken in or understand, if you look at the research, like some of what we know is what we've heard. I've got a slide in there that we talk about that when we ask people like, how do you know that? Oftentimes you can't figure out like, where did I learn that information? Because it's been so long ago that you really don't know how you adopted it. But I also put in here, so when I was writing this book and I started it during COVID, I originally had 30 mental models, and then I realized I was going to write a book that would be like 5,000 pages that nobody would want to read. I'm not sure anybody's going to want to read this anyway, but I had to narrow it down because there was so much to talk about. But then even through COVID and then more reading I did, there's many more mental models and the structured way we should think that I wanted to put in there. But even this last year, like reviewing the mental health literature, I have switched to, besides just challenging our own thinking, like it's also challenging like others thinking too and their perspective. So I say that this is horrible the way this looks, but that we have to challenge our own perspectives, because for one, we constantly talk about best practice in policing, and I always say that best practice is not really best practice. It's really just common practice. Because if we're adopting best practices like everybody else, it's just common. But this Dilbert comic strip actually just puts it the best, that the fact that if everybody's adopting it and doing the same thing, isn't it just mediocrity? But Annie Duke, in her book, she talks about thinking in bets. She talks about like how we form our beliefs and how we think we form our beliefs. And so in our heads, we actually think like we hear something, we think about it, we vet it, we determine whether it's true or false, and then we form our belief. But what she says is what we actually do is we hear something, we believe it to be true, and then only sometimes later, if we have the inclination, we think about it and we vet it. So those are the things when I say to challenge ourselves and other people, is like when you think about things or you hear something, you have to think like, how do I know that? So this next slide is something that I usually put up like in most of my classes to talk about like, how do we know these things? And where do we get our information from? And then have you checked the information? So one of the things that has kind of been on my radar because of the research I'm doing is looking at like the mental health research in the literature, right? Because I keep seeing the same things being repeated over and over again, both in the mental health literature, but also in the media. So you commonly hear, that the police officers aren't trained to answer those calls for service. And then you hear that policing criminalizes the mental health issues. And then you hear like the arrest rate is really high. So one of the articles that gets cited quite a bit is this Linda Templin. So she was one of the first authors or first researchers that tried to do some good quantitative and qualitative research about what was going on in the field. And she's got 3 articles. One is the 1984. This data is from her 1984 Managing Disorder article, police handling of the mentally ill. So this is what her data showed, and her total like observations, right, is 2,122. So when she's looking at the data, she has hospitalized, arrested, and then like informally, an informal disposition. And she shows like when people have there's no indication of mental disorder. And how she did that is having the officers rate whether they thought the person had a mental health issue, and then also her graduate students. And then they checked to make sure that they were within like, there was no significant standard deviation between like the two of them saying, yes, this person has a mental health issue. And so, and within these stops, there was 2,122 contacts, right? So this was one of her first articles looking at how many of the people with, that had a mental health issue, how many were hospitalized, how many were arrested, and then how many had an informal disposition. So you could see there that, 10 were hospitalized, 14 were arrested, and then 61 had an informal disposition. Then in one of her next articles, she looks at the relationship between the presence of mental disorder and arrest, right? So this is her 1984 Keeping the Peace, Police Discretion, the Mentally Ill. So in her article, and I still can't figure out where she gets it from, but she now looks at, instead of looking at contextually those 2,122 police citizen contacts, Now she breaks down her data to a smaller data set into like who is actually a suspect and who isn't a suspect. So this is where she comes down to 506 people, right? And of those 506 people, I'm sorry, I did not mean to hit next slide. Of those 506 people, there's 30 that have mental health issues and 476 that don't. So here, when she looks at the rate of arrest, 16 were not arrested, 14 are. This is what she writes in the article. And this was after that initial, the previous article I showed you. She says the probability of being arrested was 67% greater for suspects exhibiting signs of mental disorder than for those who apparently were not mentally ill. I cannot figure out where she gets her 67% from this data. She says 14 of the 30 mentally disordered suspects, or 47%, were arrested compared to 133 of the 476 other suspects, or 28%. Clearly, mentally ill citizens in the study were being treated as criminals. Clearly. So, and why I'm pointing this out and why I'm showing you the difference between percents and natural like frequencies. So in this case, it's raw data, right? Because this article is cited and her work is cited like some 732 times. This statement is repeated about that often, about how police are criminalizing mentally ill. And what they are, or what she uses to make this statement, is the fact that 47% of the mentally ill were arrested compared to 28%. So this is where when I talk about how data is presented, this is one study where 14 people out of, when you saw the previous slide, 2,122 contacts were arrested. Yet police are criminalizing the mentally ill. So you have to think about, like, and that's why I'm saying peer review our own perspectives. And here's why, like, I think we should think about everything we do in policing and be very critical and hard on ourselves, not just critical and hard on the academics. Because if we all want to be intellectually honest about what's occurring in the field, that means for us too. So we have to break down like our beliefs and our values into, and I'll get to it, first principle thinking. Here's her other slide that she takes in a different article she wrote on Teplin, 1984, Criminalizing Mental Disorder. And she uses this to show also that we are criminalizing mental disorder. And this is her more of her seminal article, because she's looking at comparing the arrest rates of mental disorder from non-mental disorder. And where she shows it, and she has a statement in this article too that says about the same thing. But if you look at like all of the breakdown of the nature of the incident, the violent personal crimes, interpersonal conflict, she's making the statement that because over here, that the arrest rate is 100%, 100%, 100%, 100% compared to these arrest rates over here, that means it's being more criminalized. But if you look at it, like 3 of her categories, you have 1 person being arrested. So of course you have 100%. You have 3 people being arrested out of 3, it's 100%. And that's the law, and that's one of Kahneman and Tversky's heuristics that they talk about, is the fallacy of small numbers. This is the fallacy of small numbers. Like the arrest rate is not 100%. You have small numbers. You can't extrapolate out that number. That's not going to, like if there was more mentally ill people within that data set, you would not have an arrest 100%. It just wouldn't happen. So this is back to when I said data are dem and brains are too. That's Kahneman work, talking about like that we have the system 1, system 2 thinking. Our system 1 thinking is very good for like when we're out in the field. It's our intuition, it's fast, it's automatic. System 2 is much more of our rational thinking. It's very slow. It accepts or rejects decisions. The problem is that we have these cognitive biases. So we have like, there's availability bias, confirmation bias, the belief in law of small numbers, outcome bias, base rate fallacy. There's like hundreds of biases and heuristics that we have because we don't have time. Our brain doesn't have time to think and process through every single little bit of data that it's hit with every day. Out in the policing, it's great for when we need to react, when we see something that happens like in a moment and we need to run, we need to chase, we need to do something. But often what happens with human beings is we think we're using system 2 to think about things rationally, but we're actually using system 1. Our cognitive biases and our heuristics kick in quite a bit because we have a belief system. And they've shown that our belief systems really kick in like in our teens and 20s. And like I usually ask people, like, when's the last time you changed your belief about something? And usually it's really rare for humans because usually evidence or data doesn't really make us change our beliefs. You could see this with the COVID vaccine. You could have somebody that the media puts out information, or the CDC or whomever, and you will have somebody read that information and they will get something completely different from something else. And it's because our system 1 reacts first with our intuition, our instincts, our feelings, and vets that data through our own value system. And rationale and the statistics rarely come through. And this is why I think that we have to get back to first principles thinking, which is from Aristotle, but it's about like breaking down your beliefs and your assumptions. So when you think about, if you've got an issue in policing and what you're trying to accomplish in the field, you should break it down into like what your assumptions are. So examine really like what you think you know. So I put this like, examine what you think you know. What do we know? What do we think we know? I didn't put in anything into what we think we know because I don't know what you think you know. But some of the things like we do know, for example, in the natural sciences, that the Pareto principle actually exists, the 80-20, that things do concentrate. So crime concentrates in both people and places and in property. So, the hot people, hot places, hot things. When you examine your cities by street segment and you look at where your crime concentrates across like a 3-year span, I usually have police commanders do 3 years, 1 year, and 90 days, because if you look at it, it's usually static. It doesn't change much between those 3 years. And that could let you actually be more proactive versus reactive. Like I said, crime's not linear. You can't extrapolate. Crime's not going to continue increasing if you do nothing. It just doesn't go on forever and continually increase. It usually naturally has some type of limitation and it fluctuates, right? So it's going to have some natural like set point that it goes around. It could change because of societal things that occur. When you have not enough policing, it could change. When you have blips in your system as far as economics, things like that, things can change. But you have to think about like, what do you know? And you have to break it down. So I used Jon Snow's map of Calora. Oh God, now I'm not even going to say it right. Alex, you're going to have to come back and like tell me how to say it correctly. But when they first like looked at, shutting off the street pump to reduce disease, you could say, oh, the water pump was the cause, right? But that wasn't the cause. It was actually the bacteria. And the bacteria wasn't just from the water pump. It was actually from the feces, from the homes. But it took Jon Snow, like when he mapped it, like that gave him his first like inkling. And that's why he's saying, like, when it comes to data, when it comes to understanding, that's what it should do for us. It should give us an idea about like what the issue is. And then you should start examining it. And then you should start thinking about like first principles thinking. So he didn't just stop of like, oh, this is the water is what's causing, the sickness. He started looking at interviewing families and interviewing like outside to the outliers of, was everybody getting sick who went to this water well? Was there anybody who lived in the area but didn't go to the water well? And then was there people outside the area that went? Was it there? And then what were their health practices? There's a lot more. Policing is the same way. You can't just look at data on a map or binary percent changes or any of those things and say, this is what I know. Like, you have to go deeper than that to contextualize data. And finally, that policing is really not a choice between certainty and risk, but a choice between two risks. And what I mean by that is a lot of times I think in policing, like we've done it to ourselves, but the media also does it too, is that they contextualize policing as though there's certainty in policing, and that when we make decisions about resources or new practices, that there's like a certainty to it. So here in the US, there's a new push for, having a cahoots model, or having a non armed response to mental health calls for service. And they make that like a binary choice, right? Like it has to be an armed or unarmed. But the idea behind it is it's not really like, there's not certainty, but there's risk, right? There's risk of sending somebody who isn't properly trained also. So you'll see in the media where they will say, officers aren't trained for these types of calls. And when you look at how sometimes that data is laid out, and I just saw this recently with a media article, like they reviewed officer-involved shootings here in North Carolina, and they looked at 98 different shootings, and they made the statement that 40% of those shootings involved mental health issues. So officers are not equipped to handle those calls and shouldn't be responding. They pulled the data set from the Washington Post article, and when I went through the data set and started recoding their data, I couldn't find, of the 60 some odd calls I got through, I couldn't find a call that didn't have somebody with a weapon, like firing a rifle into a mobile home park, or having a machete, out in the street in the middle of the night, slicing tires. So you have these risks, right? So your risk is a choice between sending an officer who's armed, and the risk is to the person with the weapon, or sending a person who is unarmed, and the risk is to the unarmed person. So it's not a choice of like certainty of the way the media portrays it, of police are unarmed or police are untrained and shouldn't go. There's training to deal with a call, and there's a continuum of what those calls look like when they come in, and then how do we make those decisions about who goes. So those are my 10 things that I chose. This is the book that's going to come out in September. If you have any questions, you could email me. I'm at rjmitchell@rti.org. We're also having our conference, the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, August 28th and 29th at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. We're going to have a virtual option also. And so if anybody is interested, it's www.americansebp.org. And then we're also offering, one of the things like we really see that we think is kind of an issue in policing is, that we don't have courses that teach command staff about data and how to display it and how to understand it. So we have an applied criminology and a data management course that is funded through the National Institute of Justice that's starting next year. So if you're interested in that, you could email Olivia. And I know this is probably predominantly a UK, but if you're also interested in like a virtual option of like a short course, just get a hold of us, because I think these are the things that like we can get better at, and understanding and displaying data. I think if we have the right tools, we could do better, and just be more prepared for when things come out. And it's not a defensive maneuver to say like, oh, this isn't correct or that's not correct. It's more of like a better understanding of like what we do and how we do it and why we do it. And that's it.
Thanks so much, Renee. Really interesting. So much to get us thinking about. And I know people will be thinking, my performance department, my chair of tasking, my chair of the performance meetings, my data office. We need to see and understand this more clearly. So I'm thank you for your donation of 200 books to the UK Society of Evidence-Based Policing, which we can give out. My first question is, when are you going to learn how to spell offence properly with a C and not an S? So and particularly for the UK edition, and it's cholera, by the way. But no, really enjoyed that. We don't have long actually, but so I've just got some cheeky questions for you. I mean, it'd be lovely to hear the remaining 11 models, and you and I are planning to do some podcasts, aren't we? So it would be good to get your message out there. And we find with this, over the weeks you'll have hundreds and hundreds of views on YouTube, and so I think your message will get out there. And the Simon Guilfoyle book was Intelligent Policing, by the way, that you were talking about. Okay, here's a cheeky question. When, Renee, have you believed something and then changed your mind having seen the data?
Well, actually it was about mammograms. So that was one of the first things where, I listened to my doctors and the recommendations and always did them. And then once I saw like the actual like risk factors and like the ages, and then when you should go, and then the natural frequencies, I stopped going because they talk about, and this is why, thinking about things from like that, from a continuum, and like the cost and the psychological factor, like everything, like not just thinking about things from like one point of view. They talked about like the psychological cost to women who go to a mammogram, find something, then go through the biopsy, go through like maybe a lumpectomy, to only find out like that nothing's wrong, because you do have these like normal changes. So the probability, like the statistical probability of actually having breast cancer, and they found that even if you have breast cancer when you're younger, like it never develops outside of the breast. They're finding that it could remain contained. So you're really like, your chances of like having it until you're older are so small that like you're really like putting yourself into a situation of like scaring yourself, freaking yourself out, and going under like unnecessary medical treatment, versus like doing it when you get to the age where it's actually a risk. And so those are and I'm trying to think of like other times, but I feel like I'm one of those people that are like, oh my gosh, I always thought this and I never knew. So now I have to think of a new thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think so much about evidence-based practice is, and I think you've alluded to it, is having integrity. And there's an American psychologist called Henry Cloud who said integrity is having the courage to meet the demands of reality. And I think so much about evidence-based practice is understanding the reality of what's going on the ground. And you spoke about that with context around performance charts. And there's a danger, of course, if we misunderstand the data, that we can cause things to happen that might have adverse consequences and may cause harm, either peripherally by taking officers or interventions away from other areas unnecessarily, and therefore denying them the presence of policing intervention, or creating a policing intervention unnecessarily, a bit like a medical intervention, that can also have adverse consequences. So I think that it's just really useful, and thanks for broadcasting the ways to contact you at the end of your talk. That was what I was going to emphasize. So please contact Renee and buy her book when it's out. So I really appreciate you, A, writing the book, B, getting it out there, and C, getting up nice and early to come and talk to us, Renee. Thanks ever so much for your time. And I wish everyone a good week. And next week, we're talking about urban violence. So it will be good to see you there as well. Thanks very much. Cheers, Renee.
Bye.